My name is Eric Wally, and this is What's It Like? Leadership challenges can appear in many ways. For some, it's getting a huge promotion with much greater leadership responsibility. For others, the challenge to transform can be presented by the need to take an honest look at their recruiting and hiring methods. Today, we're taking a slightly different approach to this podcast, looking at leadership challenges from the perspective of somebody who's witnessed hundreds of leadership decisions. Our guest is Deb Kurtz. Deb is the founder of Magenta Search, a boutique recruitment firm specializing in placing high-performing employees in go-to-market roles across B2B SaaS, e-commerce, B2C, and healthcare tech sectors. Her approach combines storytelling, marketing, and entrepreneurial expertise to deliver personalized recruitment solutions. Welcome to What's It Like, Deb?
Hi, Eric. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. So, Deb, you have a lot of experience and exposure to executives. You started your career in advertising sales and then moved into recruitment, and then decided, it sounds like, from a desire to kind of live your values a little bit more closely or work in them a little bit more closely, to branch out and create Magenta Search several years ago. And so it's fair to say, I would imagine, that you can see smart leadership decisions and not so smart leadership decisions pretty quickly without a tremendous amount of investigation. Is that, how would you characterize that?
Well, I get to play a very interesting role of being what would be called a consultant, or because of the agency style of business that I run, I am not I am not a full-time employee, and I work with a great variety of companies at different stages and a great variety of personalities in making some of their most serious decisions as to who to bring into their organization at senior levels. As a result of that business model, I get enormous exposure to confidential information, to wildly different personalities, different business philosophies, different interviewing tactics, different strategies, approaches. And as a result of that, it's really fascinating as to the database of information that I've gathered as to what works, what doesn't work. And of course, there's not a finite as to answers around that. I'll share, Eric, just to back up. The way that I moved into recruitment, I make the joke that very few people walk out of college saying that they want to be a recruiter. And one of the things that's interesting about the industry is that most of us who do go into recruiting is for a variety of different reasons. And a lot of them are, well, I sort of like this and I sort of like that, and somebody recommended. And I spent 12 years in the media and advertising space in the Boston market. And while I loved my career in that regard, I was always looking outwards and onwards. I was never quite satisfied. I was never quite content. As a result of that, I took action against that by interviewing a lot. And it piqued my curiosity as to how the heck people get hired. As a candidate, sort of an evergreen candidate, I sort of always had my eye open. My resume was always up to date. I was always looking and networking and looking for the thing. And I got an enormous amount of exposure as a candidate to interview processes, to the we'll be in touch next week, never being in touch next week, or the offer's coming and the offer doesn't come, or why do they want to hire me so badly when I don't see myself as a match, but I see myself as a match for that job and they don't want to hire me. It's the thing that all of us in corporate America who have gone through interview processes say, I think it went well. Oh my God, I never heard from them again. I thought it went terribly. They made me a great offer. Why? How? So I got really curious about the behind the scenes as to how these decisions are made. And I pivoted my career after 12 years into recruiting. And I've now been in recruiting for also 12 years. And I've worked for a number of different agencies and firms. And yes, about 6 months ago, I launched my own boutique firm called Magenta Search, where I am doing all aspects of the recruiting model and working very closely with leaders, a lot of founders. I work with a lot of smaller companies that may not have HR, or their HR is not focused on recruitment, and playing the role of, let me bring your story to market. Let's understand what candidates need and want, and let's understand how to position ourselves for long-term growth. So yes, that is the world that I'm living in.
That's a very fascinating world, especially if you're a curious person, and you certainly seem like one.
I was a journalism major, and yes, tell me more. No, wait, I need more details on that. You can't skip over anything. That's my nature. So
yeah. That's really cool. Especially in your role. So we're here to talk about leadership and leadership decision making. And you said something interesting a moment ago. Not that everything else you didn't say was interesting, but it seemed like you sort of alluded to that there's not necessarily a right way and a wrong way to recruit, or there might be a lot more latitude for recruitment styles. Is that accurate?
Well, there is no science on it, Eric. You can find plenty of companies who will write the science for you, consulting companies that would say we're going to develop what your interview and what your hiring process should be and how it will be most effective. But what is right for one company will not necessarily be reciprocally right for another company. And both sides of the equation, as candidates, as hiring managers, hiring teams, what is so tricky is whereas one organization might be extremely loyal to a metric of rating candidates between 1 and 5. And if the candidate doesn't score a 4.5 and above on all interviews, they get disqualified. That may be one system that works for one company. We have another company who will say things like, yeah, I think they were great. Let's go. So and as all of us are candidates, whether we're job searching at the time or not, any of us who are careerists are wondering, where are our next steps, or how do we build our career, or what is the definition of success for each of us individually? So this is a human state of ongoing exploration. We are also wondering, how do I get either the job or the promotion, or how are decisions made internally in my company so that I can continue climbing? And the truth is, it's yes, there's science that can be applied to it, but the science is going to be different for every single company and every single, even the hiring managers. How one hiring manager might make one decision, somebody on their interview agenda or panel may make decisions differently. And that is what I personally think is both fascinating and very, very difficult. We're working with psychology, we're working with behaviors, and we're working with humans. And on one hand, the more that we can drive that into a science, perhaps there's a theory that perhaps the more scientific we can be, the more we can eliminate risk for error. And that comes both in terms of hiring the wrong person or us as candidates making the wrong career decision. But the swing to that pendulum is that when we're dealing with people, science has this is an unscientific number, but about a 50% margin of error. Mm-hmm. So if you and I interview each other in a 45-minute interview and we walk away saying we think we're strong at A, B, and C, and we think we might need help, or we're not strong at X, Y, and Z, it's a 45-minute interview. It's not real life. It's not the amount that I see as to how somebody may perform in a job versus how they actually perform. It's all a risk. It's and accepting a position is also it's also a risk. You just don't know until you're into the company what it's going to be like, and you just don't know until the person is working for you what the dynamics are. And I don't have any other, yes, there are ways to minimize risk, but that's really the question that people on both sides are continuously asking. How do I minimize the risk of error? Mm. And yes, there are things that we can do. And yes, there are science equations and tests and evaluations and things that often make sense for bigger companies. Sometimes bigger companies can be very intelligent about what they know will work. I work with a lot of younger, high growth companies, startups, and if you're going to play the game, there's going to be risk. And that's on all of us. For any relationship any of us enter, there's a risk that that relationship may not work out. And that is something I think we all just need to embrace and become comfortable with. There are no guarantees in this life, as we know. And every relationship, personally, professionally, that we enter has a risk of either failing or has a risk of requiring compromise on your behalf or compromise on their behalf. And we just need to get strong and know that we're going to overcome whatever challenges come our way, because that's the only way that that's the only way to comfortably take some of these risks and move forward.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And I'm sure that, like anything else having to do with humans, the more that we do it, the more experienced we become at it, the better our judgment or our gut take on things becomes, and the better that you are at either finding the right candidate or finding the right job. How would you characterize, as you reflect back on, say, 10 years ago versus today? It seems like job candidates are equipped with more tools today than they were 10 years ago. Is that true? And how have you seen, their behavior evolve, if you have?
On the candidate side, like trying to find a job, or on the hiring side?
On the candidate side.
Oh, we've been through a really tough 2 years, Eric, of employment. I think you asked about the past 10 years. I'll first say the last 2 years of corporate America have been down years in hiring, and I would equate them most similarly to the 08-09 recession time period.
Interesting.
There has not been a tremendous amount of headlines and news about this for a variety of reasons. One, unemployment numbers are low. That is confusing when there's a lot of corporate people who are unemployed, yet unemployment is low, and we're not hearing about a recession, or we're not hearing about the high unemployment rates. It's very confusing. Why am I out of work? Why have I been? I've had a 20-year career. How can I be out of work for 18 months? How could this be happening? What is wrong with me? So there's a lot to that, which is as to what's taken place over the last 2 years. And I do spend time telling people, and I want people to understand that the validity that hiring in corporate has been significantly down from August of 22, and we are starting to see a rebound really as of September, October of 24. Colleagues and I can pinpoint that August of 22 was when the conversations shifted, dynamics changed. It took until January of 23, and then we started to hear about wild mass layoffs across the tech sectors, the mega companies, obviously, and that continued through 23. I'm not answering your question, so I will go back to your question and say, do job seekers and candidates have more at their fingertips now? Of course, with the advent of better technology and information, of course. Research, LinkedIn, everything lives online. You can walk into your interview more educated about the company. You can, with the remote work is a really complicated topic, but at the surface, well, now I can work remotely for remote companies, and I can interview in California and Texas and Maine, and I could work anywhere. So the access, I think this is a theme of what we've seen in our both economy and our society over the last 10 to 15 years, which is that access is unlimited. With the clicks of the button, we have access to so much. There's a push and a pull to that. And we've seen over the last 2 years, on one hand, it's very attractive to have all this access at our fingertips. On the other hand, everyone else has the same access at their fingertips. So now we're seeing job applications on LinkedIn for a role that's been posted for 12 hours, and we see 3,000 applicants.
Right.
And that has been an extreme challenge, both for recruiters, hiring managers, how to deal with that volume, as well as job seekers. I'm not going to get a job 1 out of 3,000. That's illogical. But the nuances that are coming into play is that it is so easy to apply for a job on LinkedIn when if I see 3,000 candidates, I would say that there's probably 1 to 2%, if not less, in that batch that actually meets the requirements.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that, talking about it from the hiring manager point of view, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but, it certainly seems like hiring is itself another full-time job. And everybody that I talk to that is hiring, when they hire, the common complaint is what you just said, inundated with, hundreds or thousands of applications that are wholly irrelevant, and trying to get help from HR, trying to get help from other constituencies within the organization to try and prune down the number and have the good candidates surface to the top. And yet, what seems to be the thing universally, in my experience anyways, I really love your opinion on this, that it's one's reputation, both on the company side as well as the candidate side, for finding a match. It seems like, well, we interviewed all these people, but Judy knew Tom, and he seemed like a really good guy. How does you're shaking your head? How does
I'm doing a bob here. I'm not trying to not take a stand. Both are true. Your network is going to be your number one means of propelling yourself forward. So yes, I hesitate to say that's reputation based, because the word reputation for an individual makes me anxious, because we as individuals grow, emerge, change. However, we do have a brand, and that would be called reputation. And yes, your network as an individual is very important. On the other side of things, I will die on this hill for eternity. Brand reputation from an employment standpoint is critical. And if we take a look at some of the top companies, top I put into quotes, however you define that, but if we take a look over the last 10 years of companies everyone wants to work for, the question of how did they get to that position? Why did they get that way? A tremendous amount has to do with candidate experience and word of mouth marketing. What are your employees saying about you? What are they putting into the universe? It's hugely important. So I'm going to say that brand reputation is one of the most overlooked and underestimated and most important aspects to becoming a powerful company and getting the talent that you want. So from a hiring standpoint, yes, companies pay attention to employer reputation. It is critical to getting the top talent. On the candidate side, I would say there are plenty of people who have no reputations, do not know people, have no network, who get hired into great jobs. I don't want to suggest that, let's say you're an introvert. Let's say you're somebody who is not good at networking, or that's scary to you, or communication skills are not a strength of yours. You and I are both communicators. We're both in advertising. We're in marketing and advertising. Like, we've been in that world. Let's imagine a totally different world where communication is, then that does not mean that we have some of the most brilliant people out there in the world that probably would never do a podcast. And that doesn't mean that they don't get hired. It does mean that there are different equations for how to get hired depending on who you are and depending on what you do. Yes, people are human. Like, that's the most important thing that I say to go back to is, how do humans organically behave? If they have an endorsement from somebody, if they know people in common, here, I'll throw out an interesting anecdote or an interesting fact. We have moved away from on resumes. We used to include our name, address went on resumes, right? We have moved away from that as a protocol. Now, if I see an address on a resume, I tell somebody, take that off, include your major city and or the area that you can commute to. So let's just pretend we're both Massachusetts. Let's pretend you lived in Framingham, and let's pretend that you could commute to either Worcester or Boston. You might put on your resume, Worcester, Boston, commutable. But the reason why we're not putting addresses anymore is because it leads to bias. So let's say you live in Framingham, bias of, oh, I know people in Framingham. I should ask around about this person. Oh, I can go to Zillow and see their home and see the cost of their home. And I've seen it work really in both ways. In bias of, if you're coming from an ultra affluent town, there's bias of, oh, I don't know if we could afford you. Or there's bias of, if you live in this location, clearly the salary we're paying aren't paying your bills, so therefore you don't need this job, so why would we interview you? And then the flip side, it's the bias that's coming into play. So what many companies are working to do is remove the bias by stripping out factual things that could lean towards bias, like what's your address, and I can look up your home or your location. But it still comes down to human psychology, which is, if there's an internal endorsement, Susie knows Bill and Bill says, oh my God, she's great. It's really hard to turn that off in one's mind. This is also where remote hiring has become really, I'll share with you like one of my quote unquote secrets is, when companies say to me, we can hire anywhere, I start by saying, where's your team? Where are the time zones? Where are the decision makers? I say, listen, let's start by a time zone. Like, that's great, you can hire anywhere, but if all of your team is on the East Coast, why would we hire somebody on the West Coast? Unless the position is so rare and so this and so that. And usually it's not. The other thing that comes into play is when people say, well, the CEO is Atlanta and the CMO is Boston. And if there's a city that has multiple employees, if there's like a little hub, then I'm going to lean towards that little hub, because I know that the more people we have in one location, it doesn't mean that they will only hire in that location, but it's a bias. We already have X many people here. It makes it financially more attractive in that if there's gatherings, they don't need hotel rooms, they don't need flights. And then you also get the bias of so-and-so knows so-and-so, and there's a language of familiarity that we speak when we know the companies you've worked at, we know people in common. That is a bias that is very, very hard to eliminate. And that's when candidates come to me to say, how do I conduct my job search? How do I get hired? In this market in the last 2 years, some of the top pieces of advice I've been giving is reverse engineer your thinking. Instead of asking yourself, what do I want to do for my next job? Ask yourself, who is going to be dying to hire me? Who needs me? So let's start with your competition. You've worked at a company. Who's your immediate competition? Because when your resume lands on the desk of your immediate competition, that's going to be attractive. That's a bullseye. A lot of people have said to me over the past 2 years, like, I've worked in ed tech, but I don't have to stay in ed tech. I'm open to moving outside of ed tech. And I bounce the question back to them. That's great that you're open to it. We'll keep our eyes open on other industries, but where are you most marketable? Ed tech. You've been in it for the past X many of years. So let's figure out who is going to grab your resume and your profile and say, that is exactly what I need. And candidates often, they just don't know the tricks that we're going to hire industry related candidates outside of non-industry related candidates. Does it mean you can't get hired in ed tech if you've never been in ed tech? No, it doesn't mean that. but it does mean let's look at the economy and what's going on. And when there's stiff competition, then they're going to gravitate towards somebody who's in the time zone, in the region, in the industry. I'm not saying that people can't make dramatic career changes, but it is easier to make dramatic career changes when it's a supply and demand issue. And right now we have too much supply and too little demand. I do see that changing. I mean, we saw in 2020, massive unemployment. And in 21, we had the Great Resignation. And oh my God, I couldn't hire AEs, sales, senior level salespeople. I do a lot of hiring in that realm, both individual contributor, and then I do sales management. Oh my God, in 21, it was like, 300K total package. Anyone interested? No, nobody's interested. Sales, so base and commission. But so we see these things change. So I just want to be clear, and anything that I'm saying on best practices are in alignment with what is happening in the markets. And again, it's supply and demand. When you as a hiring manager are looking to get somebody with this 6 criteria, if you can't get it, you're going to compromise and get somebody with the top 3 bullet points, because if it's not available. So that's something that I think is so important for people to recognize. So much of this is out of our hands and it's economically driven.
Right. Yeah, and hovering above and throughout everything you were just describing is something you mentioned earlier, which is risk and wanting to mitigate risk and blunt the risk. The times that throughout my career that I've had to look for a job or another job, you have this moment where it almost feels like a makeover opportunity, and like, oh, maybe I'll go do this other thing and be this other person, and then ultimately you realize, like, no, you need to be doing exactly what they are hiring for and have years of experience doing exactly what they're hiring for, and then maybe bring a few extras to it. But the extras are 5% of the story, not 50% of the story.
I hate to say this because I don't want to come across as either pessimistic or not open-minded, but it is shocking how young we are in our careers. It is really the first 2 to 5 years in our careers that I have seen that you have to make your transitions and changes. And once you are past that, it gets really hard. It doesn't mean you can't tweak, you can't find bridges, but then it takes multiple steps into making a career change. So my advice, and none of us get to go back to our 22-year-old selves, but I do think that time period of 22 to 25 is very important to saying this is putting you on a path. If you're working for Fortune 500 companies in that time period, it's going to be harder to go to the startup world after your resume says Fortune 500. The flip side is true. Again, it doesn't mean it's impossible. It just gets harder. And then when we're 20 years into our career, I get a lot of phone calls that say, "Hey, Deb, I've been agency for 22 years. I'm all set with it. I'm ready to go brand side. What do you got?" And it's one of the worst conversations because again, it doesn't mean it cannot happen. We have examples all the time of people that it happened for, but it's not quite as easy. What I say back to people is your challenge is that you have 22 years of working in one environment. Now you want to work in another environment. What's going to make you the best candidate that they can hire when you don't have the same background? You don't have the relevant background. Again, we're not saying that you cannot do it, but this is where connections and networking and the endorsement of I've worked with this person before, we have a great partnership. I mean, that's where we see some of these things coming into play. Yeah. But it is tougher than I wish it was to be into your career and decide that you want to move from PR into demand gen. Like, it's all marketing, it's all marcoms, but like PR is one thing, demand gen's another thing. Doesn't mean you can't do it, but you have to get really strategic as to how you're going to use bridges to get to where you want to be. And then there's also the risk, Eric, that you get to where you want to be and you say, I don't really like this either. So it's
right. Yeah. Well, it's interesting about that. I do want to talk about this from the perspective of the employer, but just to quickly address something that you just said, I did a career change. When I was 27, I decided I didn't want to be in the offset printing world, and I decided I wanted to be a marketer. I was very inspired by one of my marketing director clients. And Judith Meyerhead, if you're out there, please contact me because you changed my life. Anyway, and so I had the lucky inspiration of when I was graduating college and deciding like what I really want to do with my career. I had the lucky inspiration of saying, you know what, I'm just going to do a bunch of informational interviews. And essentially I'm going to ask one question: what is your day-to-day like? Because a job description and, reading about things online or what have you really kind of doesn't provide you with what is that day-to-day reality. And I was all over the place. I thought I wanted to maybe be in internal communications, working in HR groups. I thought maybe I wanted to be in PR, advertising, marketing. And in asking that question, it became clear, marketing is where I wanted to be, because that was that day-to-day story. And I heard that from multiple folks in the field, made me say, all right, this is me. this is my stop on the bus. This is where I'm going to be. And it helped me to kind of craft a career trajectory, a career plan. So hopefully that's helpful to our viewers. Looking at this from a hiring manager perspective, you are working with a lot of resources. You have a budget, you have precedent, you have definitions for what the position needs to do and what needs to deliver in terms of departmental and business outcomes. And you have a culture that you're working with. And part of that culture is the reputation, the brand reputation of the organization. And something that you alluded to earlier is that there's, well, I guess I'll say it this way. It seems like there's organizations that understand how they treat candidates is part of branding, their brand reputation, their brand reality. And then there's organizations that kind of look at their candidate interactions as sort of like a transaction, like people waiting in a deli counter. And if they still do that, take the tab and here's your number. No, you didn't work out, and walk away. What have you seen about that? And is that something that hiring managers really need to be mindful of, that how they treat candidates is a reflection of their brand and therefore, in of itself, an important part of leadership?
I'll take it one step. A hiring manager, forget the brand for a second. A hiring manager, when they're interviewing and hiring, is a reflection of their own personal brand. Remember, I said this before, I'm going to say it again. We all play the same roles. We are all candidates, and not all of us are hiring managers, but all of us are, as careerists, walk on both sides of this line. So my first recommendation is, when you are in a hiring position, in a recruiting position, whatever role you're playing in the hiring process, your brand is on the front lines. So think about that first and foremost. And then secondly comes the business, which is, listen, it's a lot of people want things that are exclusive. And this is a psychology. People want things that are exclusive, and they want things that feel good. And therefore there's this careful blend of, we want to give candidates a great experience so that they feel good, but we also want to make sure that we're not just hiring anyone. We want to remain exclusive. And a lot of these things they require most of it comes down to communication. Most of it comes down to, how do you treat somebody in your email communication, in your interview communication. For bigger companies, I hear a lot, like the hiring manager and I were amazing together. And then I got an email from the recruiter saying, thank you very much for your interest. We're rejecting you. And they're like, well, no, wait, the hiring manager loved me. I promise they don't want to reject me. I mean, the truth is they're rejecting you, period, the end. But the disconnect between the communication is so vast that people then blame recruitment, or they blame HR, they blame the messenger. For big organizations, it's really hard to take the time to either explain to candidates why you're not moving forward. I mean, that's not productive. We don't make money as a recruiter. I do not make money explaining to somebody why they're not being moved forward in a process. However, I have a brand and I have a company, and I know that I want people to have positive experiences with me so I can continue to grow my brand and my company. It's also a fact, like, there's a lot of legalities, there's a lot of screaming about giving feedback, a lot of screaming about, like, they said I did great and then they rejected me. Oh, I could talk forever about this, Eric, but for the purpose of the time we have together, from a hiring manager perspective, and anything through the hiring process, I would say treat your candidates as you would treat your clients, as you would treat anyone who comes in off the street. It sort of is in line with, there's the phrase, evaluate somebody's character based on how they treat somebody who cannot do anything for you, how you treat the person behind the counter, how you treat somebody doing a menial job. I would advise, from a hiring perspective, to make sure that every communication is professional, polite, and appreciative. Those three things: professional, polite, appreciative, will cover your basis at the bare minimum of giving a good candidate experience. HubSpot some years ago began a policy that anyone who was rejected from a job had the option to elect into a 15-minute, maybe it was 10 minutes, but elect into a feedback session in which the company would give feedback as to why they weren't selected. I think there's a reason why HubSpot is one of the biggest, the best, the most desirable. That was an excellent move on HubSpot's behalf. HubSpot has resources that a startup or smaller companies don't have, which is a full-time, employees. You can say, yes, I have the time. My job is to give you a good interviewing experience. So that example of HubSpot giving that feedback, I'm sure HubSpot was extremely careful on legalities. I'm sure that they gave some real feedback as to how somebody could improve. And they also probably stayed away from anything that could be subjective, such as, well, we just didn't like the way you answered that question. Like, that's challenging. Kudos to HubSpot for doing that. Most companies can't afford to have that kind of dedication to candidates that they are rejecting. So again, depending on who the company is and what kind of resources you have, at the barest minimum, I would say in rejecting and communicating with candidate, rejecting them and or communicating with them, let's work to treat people professionally and politely and respectfully. And that will not go against you. It may not make you HubSpot, but it will not work. It will at least not work against you. And just, if you miss an interview, if you're late to an interview, just the apologies, the respect for somebody else's time. If you have a terrible candidate that never should have been set up for an interview, you don't need to tell them that they're terrible. You don't need to say this is a waste of my time. You don't need to say that you're not a match. Just go through the process and the interview early. There are ways to handle situations so that, I mean, selfishly, it is being kind, but it's not for altruism. It's to protect your own brand and your own company. And I don't mean to make it sound so Pollyanna, but there's going to be very little good from any of us putting into the world hurtful rejection, whereas neutral or positive rejection with thank you, we appreciate you, we were impressed. Unfortunately, it's not going to work out. If you can share a factual reason why it won't work out, such as you have 3 years of experience in X and we need a minimum of 6 years of experience. Now the response for that may be, well, you saw that on my resume. Why'd you even interview me? Like, yes, we can get into circles over and over, but leaning on fact as to why somebody is being rejected is great if you can do it. And if you can't, it is okay to say, I have a process going on right now that we have 3 excellent candidates and only 1 person will get the job. And the very real honesty is that 2 of the 3 will be rejected. And the only information I will be able to give them, which is truthful, is there was nothing wrong with you. You did not, like, we had to choose 1 and we had to reject 2. And there will be reasons why they made those decisions, but those reasons, all 3 of them are fantastic.
Yeah. And I love the way that you just painted that picture of how each side is sort of processing that. Are there other examples of doing it the right way, being respectful of candidates and understanding that this is how you treat them is a reflection of your reputation and your company's reputation, that can, just to sort of sum up what you've been saying, it's a little bit of a tightrope in terms of the level of transparency that you can be, that you can exhibit, and also the time it takes. Now, we live in a world of marketing automation where you can presumably keep candidates notified instead of ghosting them. But are there other things that you've seen where you're like, that's a smart way of handling this?
Yes, I'll touch quickly on the marketing automation. Silence is the worst, but what's, in my opinion, what I've seen people say is what's also next to worst is the marketing automation that says, "Dear X, thank you for your interest. You've been rejected." I know we don't have time to customize every rejection. Like the HubSpot, like that's a luxury. So I know that there's a time element, but the automatic rejection, I think the automatic rejection is perfectly great for somebody submits a resume, they're not right, send them an automatic rejection. I think that is fine. Stemming into your next question is what else can we be doing, is the deeper somebody goes into the process, the more we need to be prepared to give something in return to them upon rejection. So if somebody goes 5 rounds, if they're meeting with the C-suite, if they're meeting with VPs, like it depends on the role and it depends on how deep they go. But the more time that they spend over the course of weeks or months, oh God, I hope these processes aren't taking months, but sometimes they do. The more time that somebody spends, the more we as companies, hiring managers, recruiters, we need to be willing to give them the respect as an individual person to spend time on the feedback. Even if somebody goes deep into an interview process and I reject them, I always try to give them a half an hour follow-up. They're eager to have it. They want to know what they did wrong. They want to know what they could have done better. They want to know why didn't this work out my way? And most times it will not be productive for me to actually tell them why. If it's factual, I'm happy to share it, such as you didn't have industry related experience, our other candidate did. Unfortunately, we went with the one that had. If it's factual like that, then I will share it. It's not, yes, it's a legality issue, but there's also so much lack of science behind why these decisions are made. And there are decisions that are made, whether it's right, wrong, or otherwise, which is, I just think they'll be a great match. I want to work with that person. Our vibe was excellent. They had experience. They did X and Y. They told me about that. And we could use that here. And this is part of the reason why we're never going to be able to eliminate the human factor in hiring. And for me to tell somebody, or a hiring manager to tell a candidate, like, they just liked somebody else better, that is not productive for the candidate. It's not productive for the company. I want anyone who interacts with me and my clients to walk away feeling, even if they're rejected, feeling like this is what I brought to the table, and they appreciated that. And now I can use that. Now I'm confident knowing that I do well when I speak about X and Y. I at least want to reject somebody into the universe with, this is what was really impressive, and I'm sorry it didn't work in this situation. Keeping the doors open also, I'll just lean into this, Eric, the notion of like, it's not going to work this time around, but we do want to keep the doors open for you. People often roll their eyes at that. Like, you're never going to remember me. You're going to move on. One of the things that I found fascinating in my own interviewing back from when I was in advertising was how much that interviewing built my network and how much people repopulated. And now even years later, I'll meet somebody, I'll be like, oh my God, you were working at that company. I interviewed at that company in 2008. Remember, they were located here and here. And it's interviewing is also a form of networking. So when you don't get the offer, it's the worst. But we have to look at, what did I benefit from this? Who did I meet? And how did those people that I meet, how can I utilize them to continue to open doors and build my network? And that willingness, especially if somebody is a strong candidate, a good person, relevant in your community, relevant in your industry, if you take them multiple rounds in an interview process, offer them, hey, I'm so sorry this opportunity did not work out. I think that you're a great candidate. I would be happy to help you network. I would be happy to keep the door open for conversations down the road. Those are just the touches that require some thoughtfulness that make an impression, that let people walk away saying, I'm really disappointed, but that was a great experience. And that's where companies start to build their employer brand.
And it's really interesting what you just said from the perspective of the employer brand, in that, if that candidate that you fell in love with doesn't work out for whatever reason, right? You've got relationships with, your top 2 or 3, perhaps.
100%. And again, we have no science here. People change, decisions change, requirements change. That's why I say that this is a long game. And the relationships that you have, you need to nurture them. It doesn't work to jump on LinkedIn when you need a job. You need to be on, and it's not just LinkedIn. Like, LinkedIn may be comfortable for some people and uncomfortable for others, but it's the art of having real relationships, not just when you need something. That is not what pays you back. You can't just jump on LinkedIn and say, I'm unemployed, I'm looking for my next thing. Yes, it might work. You could get help, but what will really help is if you have a whole network of people who are like, oh my God, Deb needs help. Of course I want to help because I know her and she's helped me in the past, or they have some positive assimilation. And that is the long game. And that's why I would say to companies, hiring managers, hiring teams, is to put in some practices that don't need to be enormous. They just need to be respectful. You will leave that job eventually. You will be looking for your next job eventually. People remember how they're treated. And that's, again, it's not meant to be Pollyanna or either altruism. It's put yourself in a position so that people will want to help you when you will need it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to ask you another couple of questions. Do we have time?
Sure, go for it.
Cool. So what if you work for a company that doesn't really care about people? It doesn't really care about their people. Here's what I'm thinking about. Years ago, there was this company that had a terrible reputation for how it treated its employees. And there was really sort of, it lived to the opposite of everything that you're saying. It really developed this reputation that, it was a terrible place to work. The hiring processes were really tough, and there was a lot of churn. That's the thing I kept hearing. And, at a networking event, I bumped into the head of HR for this organization.
Okay.
And knowing that this was probably the only time I was ever going to speak with this woman, I asked her point blank, how do you deal with that? And her comment back, I thought, was very shrewd. She said, we went down the road of having, management team offsites and leadership coaching sessions and executive coaches, and it's just the DNA of the leadership. And so we finally decide to just own it and say, this is who we are, and let that inform their processes. What if you are a person that perhaps intuitively understands, I need to treat everybody with respect, but the culture of the company that you work for, maybe not so much. Everybody's a number. Mm-hmm. What do you do? How do you navigate that beyond just saying, I quit, I want to go work for a company that gets it? Mm-hmm. What are ways to navigate that situation?
The first recommendation I would make is for candidates who you are seriously interviewing. You don't need to reveal too much in a first screen, but transparency. Hi, candidate so-and-so, thanks for taking the time. I want to tell you about our company. I want to tell you about who thrives here and who doesn't thrive here. It is not we as humans, we match places, we don't match places. We like certain restaurants, we don't like certain restaurants. It doesn't necessarily make us, some of us like to ski, some of us don't like to ski. That doesn't make any of us a good person or a bad person. And when I have represented companies, I've represented plenty of companies that do not have shiny reputations. And when I do, I ask the questions as to where do the challenges lie and why. Why are the challenges there? If it comes down to the CEO is this way and they will never change. When I bring the opportunity to the candidates, I am transparent to say, here's the good. I'm going to share with you what may be a challenge. You'll have to see for yourself. The CEO is set in their ways in this regard. So to answer your question, if somebody is at a company that has a tough reputation and they're hiring and they don't want to be, they want to make sure they're doing sort of the right thing for their own brand and their company brand, it's owning what the challenges are. It's owning this may not be the right thing for all people. Let me share with you, these are the kind of people, these are the characteristics it takes to thrive at this company. If that doesn't align with you, like no hurt feelings, that's just how it's going to be. Amazon. We all know Amazon just said 5 days back to work, January, take it, leave it, go get a new job, don't get a new job. I've talked to several of my connections who work at Amazon. It's been very interesting because I've asked them like, how are you feeling? What do you think? And they all sort of have the same reaction, which is it doesn't matter what I think. This is what the company is doing and I can stay or I can go. And it's interesting to me that they've all sort of had that same reaction, just very accepting of this is what it is. And if I go, that doesn't say anything about me as my work ethic. It doesn't say anything about how hard I work. It doesn't say anything if I'm good enough or not good enough to be at Amazon. And if I stay, it also does, it's just an individual decision. Does this work for your world? If yes, stay. If not, go. And if you're working for a company that has a particularly tough reputation or a reputation for churn or listen, everything's marketing, Eric. Like it's all about marketing and it's about marketing with some honesty. And it may be in your interview process you build. These are the reasons why people love working at this company. These are the reasons we do have high churn. I can share with you the stats. Let me share with you. We have about 15% churn annually. That is higher than what other companies see. I want to address that head on. Let me share with you. This is a company that we do expect you to be available at 8 p.m. at night. If that's not comfortable for you, then this is not going to be a good match. Like get it out in the upfront. Doesn't mean you're a good person or a bad person if you are available for phone calls at 8 p.m. at night. It just is. So I think that transparency and owning not all things are right for all people. And that is not a judgment on who any of us are. It just is. And I think where people where the reputations get soured is when there's, I'm just role playing this, we're a company that we would know that if we call you at 8 p.m., you're going to answer. Is that you? Now that feels judgmental. Whereas if you phrase it a little bit kinder to say, we are an always on organization. The benefits of that are at 2:00 in the afternoon, you might be out for a run because you have an open time slot on your calendar. The push and the pull of that is that at 8 p.m., if there is something that's urgent, we would expect you to handle it. The fact of the matter is most companies in our world today, if you have something burning at 8 p.m., you're going to need to handle it regardless of if the company tells you to or not. But that aside, there's also the precedent of like what's expected. And most people don't want to hear that they're expected to work at 8 p.m. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's excellent. I love the way that you put that in terms of, it just being factual and respectful, right? And just laying it out there, being transparent, explaining to your candidates, because ultimately you're going to get better candidates and you're going to do a better job of communicating what you want online in things like job descriptions and your follow-up communications and so forth. And what you're saying, particularly about being factual with, follow-up communications, whatever they might be, is that seems to add a little bit extra responsibility of the job description, because a lot of job descriptions aren't great, right?
Right. I make the joke. Part of the reason I have a job is because job descriptions are written terribly. So that's another big factor. Job descriptions are notoriously not written clearly enough. Some of it may be that there are a lot of reasons for it. It may be that the person who's actually writing the job description is not the hiring manager, so they're taking some guesses. It may be that we're trying to make the job description sound attractive, so we get people to apply, but we're missing what I learned when I went into recruiting, Eric. This was one of my most favorite learnings. When I went into recruiting, and I was recruiting and still am for marketing, advertising, media, account services. So those all PR, sales. Guess what? These all fall into similar worlds, like PR and sales. In PR, you're selling something, and sales, you're selling something. So the confusion that people have as to, I'm right for this job. Yes, I've been in PR and I'm applying for a sales job, but PR is really sales. So the skills transfer. So that should be what I learned, that in job descriptions, there are often 1 or 2 sentences or lines that actually indicate what the job is looking for. So it might be, if they mention a technology, like must be adept at using Salesforce, or in marketing, like must have used HubSpot, Eloqua, Marketo, or a similar tool. What that means is that they are looking for somebody who knows that part of the marketing funnel. And oftentimes, using marketing as an example, like marketing job descriptions are written very vaguely. They can range from like being great at content to being creative to being data driven. And you and I right now would say, I'm great at content and I'm data driven and I'm creative. Oh my God, you and I are both a match for that same job because we can check those boxes. It's super subjective and it's not clear. The one things that are clear is when they say experience in this tool preferred, let's replace that with required. Companies are worried that, like, well, if they don't have HubSpot, but they have Marketo, that would be fine. And they're worried about eliminating somebody who could be right if they don't have the right tool. So they use the word preferred. But if you don't know what HubSpot or Marketo is, you are not a match for that job.
Right.
So that's one of my keys of telling people how to figure out if they're right is look at the proper nouns. What tools are we talking about? Do you know what they are? Another is to look at if you can track down who the hiring manager is. Look at what they do and try to backwards engineer where this role fits into their team. I know it sounds very frustrating to say, like, if you've been in PR, but then you want to go into sales, you're going to have a tough time making that transition. Yes, but what my recommendation would be is let's take your PR experience. Let's try to move you into a sales role in the PR industry. So maybe you're selling PR software that you are selling to the audience that you are, to PR people. And therefore you can say, I was in your position 6 months ago, and now I represent a software, and it's useful because, like, we can find like bridges and baby steps to capitalize on past experiences.
Yeah. And there's a lot more I'm sure we could explore and discuss about that. I want to thank you so much, Deb. This has really been illuminating and interesting. I think that you have a really great perspective. And when it comes time for me to hire folks, I certainly will come back to you.
Thank you, Eric. I'll send you the bill right away.
All right, good. Because I think it's very important to balance the sort of humanity with the business needs. And what has come through in this interview is that's exactly what you do, which is fantastic.
It is a very tough, as I said, we've been in a tough world the past 2 years, and there's a lot of anger, and that anger all comes out over social media as to who's getting hired and why, and what's fair and what's not fair. And in current events, last week's tragic shooting of the United Health CEO, there's so much emotion that has been going on, and it's easy to bring that emotion to social media because nobody's stopping us from doing it. And then we're impacted by seeing what the world is saying. I mentioned the last week's tragedy because it's corporate America, it's healthcare, it's a CEO. It still is rattling that can happen on the streets on Fifth Avenue or Sixth Avenue. So the emotions are high, and my coaching is to approach with empathy. We don't know people's stories on every side of the equation. You don't really know why you didn't get hired. You don't really know why this candidate pulled out of the process. We don't really know. And let's focus on the business ahead of us. Pontificating on why you didn't get the job or pontificating on why it was not fair is not going to get you the job. And it's easier said than done, but if we can try to strip out the emotion and say, my goal is to get the very best talent that I can. My goal is to get the very best job that I can, whatever that definition is. Focus on action. I'm big on action. Yes, cope with the emotion, but try to keep the emotion off of the professional realm. Deal with the emotion, friends, therapists, people who love you no matter what. That is where the emotion can go. And yes, things are unfair. No question. Things are unfair, but that is somewhat the way of the world. So we need to learn how to cope with what is unfair and to take action to move forward to achieve exactly what we're trying to.
That's excellent. Well, again, thank you again, Deb.
Thank you, Eric.
And thank you to our audience for watching or listening to this episode of What's It Like? We hope today's conversation sparked some curiosity and gave you some insights about your own leadership skills and decision making. Don't forget to share a link to this What's It Like episode with your friends and colleagues. And of course, I'd love to hear any and all feedback that you have to share. Until next time, stay curious, keep exploring, and stay on the lookout for the next episode of What's It Like?